So, Donald Trump posted the above message on his social media app Truth Social, claiming he will punish Russia with large scale sanctions and tariffs. Now, the United States has already imposed extensive sanctions and tariffs on Russia in response to its invasion of Ukraine. We've targeted their financial systems, their energy sector, trade, and key individuals and various businesses. Now, these measures have significantly reduced US Russia trade down to less than 3 billion from 36 billion in 2021. We've also restricted Russia's access to global markets, technology, and capital. Now, despite all of this, President Trump's threat of large scale banking sanctions and tariffs suggests an intent to escalate economic pressure further to force Russia to negotiate. But what tools remain in Trump's pain applying toolbox here? Well, first off, the United States could enforce a full embargo on remaining US Russia trade. Now, the US has banned most Russian imports, including oil, gas, and key commodities, since 2022. However, some trade persists, notably fertilizers, at about $1.4 billion in trade, uranium and metals like palladium and rhodium, which equal about $2 billion in trade. But unfortunately, these are critical for US agriculture, nuclear power, and the automotive industry. Trump could impose a complete trade embargo, halting all remaining imports and exports. This would cut off Russia's last direct revenue stream from the US, though the impact might be limited given the already low trade rate we have. To avoid domestic backlash, the US would also need to secure alternative suppliers, such as Canada for uranium. And we aren't exactly on super friendly terms with them right now. Or possibly South Africa for palladium, and they're actually more friendly with Russia than they are with us. So that could hinder implementation somewhat. The next thing Trump could do is secondary sanctions on third countries. Now, the US has targeted specific organizations and businesses in China, North Korea, and Iran for aiding Russia's sanctions evasion, but enforcement has been selective, and the actual countries themselves have avoided it. Major trading partners like India and Turkey continue buying Russian oil and goods without any kind of penalties coming from the US. Trump could expand secondary sanctions to penalize any country or company trading with Russia, especially those purchasing discounted Russian oil. I mean, India is a major culprit of this. Now, this could involve barring these entities from US financial systems or markets. For example, sanctioning Chinese banks facilitating Russia's energy trade or Indian refiners exporting processed Russian oil, and this could disrupt Moscow's workaround economies. The risk is diplomatic fallout and economic disruption with what are ostensibly allies. This could potentially reduce compliance and also force these countries into a choice of who they want to support. The US could also target Russia's shadow fleet and energy exports. Right now, the US and G7 nations imposed a $60 per barrel price cap on Russian oil. It's been in place for about 3 years now. We've also sanctioned over 180 Russian vessels that operate in Russia's shadow fleet. This is that opaque area of transportation where tankers can evade restrictions by removing their flags or turning off their beacons and operating in a secretive manner. Now, Trump could actually deal a pretty significant death blow to this shadow fleet, and it would hurt Russia quite a bit by sanctioning all insurers, shippers, and ports globally that service Russia's shadow fleet, effectively grounding the fleet itself. Additionally, the United States could use its influence in the G7 to further reduce the oil price cap to something like $40 a barrel, or they just may ban all Russian energy exports outright, regardless of destination. This would choke Russia's primary revenue source. I mean, energy accounts for about 40% of Russia's budget, but enforcement would be challenging and global oil prices could spike, and we also could, again, alienate some allies that are still reliant on the stability that Russian oil provides. Now, Trump also speaks about banking sanctions, and there is some room here for the Trump administration to apply pain. Major Russian banks are already excluded from SWIFT and US financial systems, and the Treasury actually made a smart move in January by changing the rules and Trump proofing the sanctions so that it requires Congress to reverse the banking sanctions. But since Trump seems to be willing to apply more pain in this sector, he could target smaller Russian banks and financial clearing platforms that are still operating internationally, especially those in China and Kyrgyzstan. A broader move could be freezing all Russian central bank assets globally or sanctioning foreign banks holding Russian reserves. Though again, this risks destabilizing some countries that rely on these reserves in order to ensure that their people get things like food. They're generally poor countries that rely on Russia, and the United States doesn't necessarily want to send them into a crisis. And some of these countries we would like to have their help in leveraging against Russia, such as Armenia. Now, Trump could tariff and sanction indirect Russian trade as well. Now, as I said, direct US imports from Russia are minimal. However, Russian goods still enter the US indirectly via third countries. Trump could impose tariffs or bans on goods from countries like China or Vietnam if they contain Russian inputs, things like Russian wood, for instance. This would require a pretty robust supply chain tracking and could disrupt global trade, but it would further isolate Russia's economy by closing loopholes. And then finally, there are additional cyber and technology restrictions that could be applied. Export controls have cut off Russia from advanced Western tech, such as semiconductors, forcing their reliance on inferior suppliers like Iran and their own inferior domestic production. But Trump could intensify cyber sanctions by targeting Russia's tech sector with broader IP bans or disrupting its digital infrastructure. Interestingly, despite the fact that Russia has its own core internet, it still relies on the broader global internet systems for trade and international payment clearing outside of the SWIFT system. I mean, it's based on the backbone of US technology and US infrastructure. So there is some leverage here, and the United States could disrupt this infrastructure pretty easily. Unfortunately, though there would be some pain, Russia has insulated itself by redirecting trade to China, India, and others, building a wartime economy with 40% of its spending on defense. Sanctions bite, but they bite slowly, as we've seen with slow degradations in their economy, higher inflation, ruble depreciation, worker layoffs, etc. The problem is, while the US is insulated quite well against Russia's economic pain and response, harsher measures risk alienating allies, or even triggering countermeasures like rare earth export bans from Russia and China. Hence why Trump is actively seeking out Ukrainian rare earth minerals. The problem is, with Russian trade already being so low and sanctions so broad, if these are implemented singularly, the impact would be minimal and may only be symbolic. However, if there were a combined implementation of at least 3 of these routes, it would significantly harm Russia, probably cripple them almost immediately. The problem arises, though, with the political willingness of the Trump administration and how far they want to take such pain, as well as the enforcement on the global stage. We'll have to see what exactly takes place and see if Russia responds by coming to the table and potentially negotiating some kind of settlement or at least a ceasefire in the near term. As I said before, Putin is interested in a near term ceasefire, but likely is uninterested in a broad, long term peace.